Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask my friend Brendan Chilton, who runs the Labour EUROSCEPTIC organisation, Labour for Britain, to speak on behalf of his organisation. So I'd ask you to save any questions, and then the two of us will take them collectively when Brendan has finished. Brendan.
Thank you, Dan. Well, good evening, comrades. And in the Labour Party, we're all comrades now. I'd just like to thank Dan and his office and his team for organising this meeting and for inviting us here to speak this evening. And also to all of you for turning out on a Friday night to listen to us speak about something that's very important indeed. It's the biggest political decision this country is going to take, and it will bind us one way or the other for the next 30 to 40 years, because I think even if our side doesn't win this argument, that flame of Euroscepticism and the arguments that Dan put will still live on, and I think it will be each generation's turn to renew that argument and to renew the case one way or the other. Before I go on, I just want to make a very brief notion of thanks. They're not here tonight, but the several Labour Eurosceptic MPs, for them it has sometimes been a very lonely place in the Parliamentary Labour Party, but they've carried on through thick and thin, making the case from the left for a Eurosceptic argument and to put Britain's interests first. So I think we should really say thank you to those for the efforts they've put in over the years. So I'll just speak about really what Labour for Britain is and what we're trying to do. We've really been set up since May, following the general election. We were previously in a form called Labour for a Referendum, and our job was to convince the Labour Party to commit to holding an in-out referendum based on a renegotiation. And in that endeavour we utterly failed until after the general election, when it became apparent that the Conservatives had won and there would be a referendum coming, so the Labour Party changed its position. Labour for Britain is saying that we should not leave, the left broadly, Labour, Greens, whatever, should not leave the renegotiation to David Cameron and to the Conservatives. We have different views on what a renegotiated membership of the European Union should be. We would place, for example, greater emphasis on improving and enhancing social and employment rights, whereas perhaps some on the right would like to diminish them in some way. So there are two strands here. And so we want the Labour Party to put forward its own case for renegotiation, as an effective opposition in the House of Commons should. It should stand up and say, this is our alternative. Unfortunately, at the moment, that doesn't appear to be happening. We also want to ensure that our friends in the trade union movement play a very important role in this, because we already have, in our opinion, some of the most restrictive trade union laws in the country, and we do fear that under a Conservative renegotiation we could see those limits further restricted. Now, the Labour Party has historically been a Eurosceptic party. Some of you will remember Peter Shaw, Barbara Castle and the late Tony Benn, all of whom come from different strands of the Labour Party, but all of whom shared that fundamental belief that actually decisions should be made here, and as Dan said, we, the British people, should have the right to hire or fire our politicians and not have it left to commissioners and bureaucrats in Brussels over whom we have no say whatsoever. Now, I think one of the things we need to remember, the Labour Party does have a very strong internationalist tradition. It comes from the solidarity movement, from the international trade union movement, which has existed for a long, long time. There is a genuine feeling in the Labour Party that we should be working with countries in Europe, we should be working with countries across the world. We're not anti-European. And I don't believe anyone here is anti-European. By definition of our location, we are Europeans. We just object to the construct of the EU which has been put upon us. And we want that gone. Now, I think one of the things you also need to note is the Labour Party, you don't often hear Eurosceptic arguments from our side. And I think actually it's quite odd, because most of the arguments, in my opinion, against the current setup, which is the European Union, come from the left. We spoke about corporatism. How can it be right? I mean, the left itself, how can we be supporting an institution which favours big business over the small entrepreneurs, over public sector workers and social enterprises? But the Labour Party is wholly committed to remaining come what may. That to me seems entirely bizarre. I also think we need to understand the following, that in the 1980s, the Labour Party really rallied behind the European Economic Community, now the EU, when most of the social protections that we currently enjoy came about as a result of changes in the European community then during the 80s, when perhaps social democracy wasn't doing as well in Britain as it could have been doing. So there's been that affinity. However, over the past few years, we've seen that change, particularly with what's going on in Greece, which we all know about. I won't go into that, combined with austerity across Europe, and also a general feeling that there is great disengagement between the peoples of Europe, not just here in Britain. This is something going on across the whole of Europe, as Dan will probably tell us later on from his experiences across the European Union. It's not just a British phenomenon. Labour Party conference just this week was just finished. We had representatives of the Dutch Labour Party, the French Socialists and the Italian Socialists all coming up to our little stall and saying, we agree with you, we're not happy. So it's not something that's happening in Britain in isolation. Now, I think coming from the left, just before I carry on, these are available at the end, it's just our perspective on things, but by all means come and have a look. The trade union movement really, I think, brought Labour to become more of a pro-EU party, because, as I said, of the difficulties in the 80s. But at the TUC conference 2 weeks ago now, the GMB trade union, possibly the most pro-EU trade union, tabled a motion to the General Congress calling on the TUC to campaign for withdrawal from the European Union if workers' rights were threatened under the current renegotiation. Now, that is an enormous move when you consider their position. 10 years ago, die-hard supporters of our membership, uncompromising, we must stay, and they're now advocating withdrawal. And I think that's a crucial move. And a lot of other trade unions, including the RMT, they're not affiliated to the Labour Party, but they're also in favour of leaving. And I think we'll see, as we move forward in this debate, a lot more trade unions coming out and saying, well, actually, we don't favour the current setup because it's not in the interests of workers, it's in the interests of big business. One little note. Across the EU during the economic crisis, the recapitalisation of banks was encouraged. We must pump money in to support the banks. But did you know, under our current terms, we cannot pump any money into failing industries under state aid laws. One rule for the big financial commercial sector and another rule for small and medium businesses. I think we can tell what this club has been set up for. It's not been set up for the people or the workers of Europe, it's been set up for the elites of Europe. And that's why I think we've got to really look at this and say, do we want to remain a member? Now, one of the things I think we've also got to think about here is the actual referendum itself. Now, I know there must be people from the audience here that support the Conservatives, UKIP, Labour, and none as well. This referendum will be won or lost, in my view, by winning the centre-left. Because UKIP voters will vote to leave. That's the whole purpose of UKIP, isn't it, to get us out of the EU. The Conservative Party, I don't know, you might have a different view, Dan, but I think it's pretty sort of 60-40 split at the moment, roughly. The Labour Party, from our sort of research and information, we gather it's about 75-25 in favour of remaining. So the arguments cannot be about one single issue, particularly immigration. Immigration is a feature of this campaign. It's one issue. The key one, as Dan said, has got to be the economic argument. That is the only way we'll win this campaign. Because we've got to make people believe in something better. Part of my education as a child was to be sent to my grandmother's on a Saturday, where her version of looking after me and keeping me occupied was to compel me to watch Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, sometimes on repeat. She was a very religious lady, and that was how I was raised. And many other films from the 50s and 60s, biblical films. There's a scene in The Fall of the Roman Empire where an old senator gets up in the Senate of Rome, and there's a debate about whether or not we should allow citizens, of other states to settle within the empire, and they all say, oh, well, the empire will collapse if we do this. And he gets up, this senator, and he says, the empire will only collapse if people stop believing in it. If people stop believing in it. I think people have stopped believing in the European Union. I think they're seeing an organisation which is remote, undemocratic, no accountability on its accounts, as Dan highlighted. They've stopped believing. This referendum is ours to win, and we can do it. As long as we appeal to a broad audience, as long as we work together, which I think is really crucial, that tonight, for example, we've got both the left and both the right and everyone in between here this evening to debate these issues. But I think one of the things we must do is, whatever the outcome, if we win, and I sincerely hope we do, we must respect it even if we don't. We are democrats above all things. If we don't win and we stay, we accept it and we campaign for changes within. But we go into it fighting to win. I think that's very important indeed. So in terms of our support as an organisation, at the moment we have the grand total of 7 Labour members of Parliament who are on board and working very hard for Labour for Britain against a rather overwhelming opposition within the PLP, but we're working at it. We've got 200 Labour councillors or so on board following our conference, which is important for building a grassroots campaign. We have also got officially 1 General Secretary of the good old Bakers Union, key people to have on board. They're supporting us as well. And of course we've got John Mills, who's Labour's largest donor. We're all saying, come on Labour, we mustn't leave this to the right. We must embark upon changing Europe. One of the things I just want to quickly mention, because I don't want to go on for too much longer, I'm conscious I've been at it for about 15 minutes, Jeremy Corbyn, good old comrade Corbyn. Now we know he's a Eurosceptic. We know he is. He's voted against every measure in the House of Commons against further integration. Please don't write him off as a turncoat or a U-turner. He's leading the Labour Party at the moment at a very challenging time. He's got to pick his battles. And at the moment, if he came out and said, right, everyone, we're leaving the EU, we would have a bit of a fight on his hands. So give him time. That's all I would say. Give him time. Because most of his policies, let's just jump forward a few years and I'll finish on this. General election 2020. You have all voted on our programme and we have a massive Labour majority in the House of Commons. Dan's had enough and left the country as a result. And we're in the first cabinet of the Labour government. Corbyn's just been to see the Queen. Probably a very interesting meeting that was. And he sits at the cabinet table and he says, right, Secretary of State for Transport, how are we getting on with renationalising the railways? And she turns around and says, well, sorry, Comrade Premier, we can't. Oh, why? Well, you see, we're not allowed to exclude, under our current terms of membership, private enterprise from running the railways. OK, forget that one then. Right, Energy Secretary. How are we doing with taking back into public ownership all those nasty companies that whack up our... sorry, Comrade Premier, we can't. Because we're not allowed, for the same reason, the Secretary of State for Transport. OK, right, fine. Chief Secretary. Tax avoidance. How are we getting on with... No, sorry, same reason, we can't. What's the point? The country's just voted for him. Let's pray. The country just voted for him. We're in government. He can't implement his policies, but he's been elected by the British people and he can't implement them because of our terms of membership of the European Union. How can that be right? That a British government, elected by popular mandate, whether you agree with the policies or not, cannot implement them because essentially a foreign power says you can't. Totally wrong. Let's leave.